And we are recording. So now's a good time if you have any questions. That way we can get it recorded, and your classmates can benefit from it. So Cook is online. Hunter is online. Durgan is online. Hannah is online. Larissa is online. Isabel is online. And Burton is online. Let's see. I see Crowder has joined us. Good morning. All right, I know it's 3 minutes early, but because we're behind and because all the information I'm going to give you for the most part is not new information, I'm going to go ahead and start at least with announcements. Also because we're recording. So really quick with the announcements. Oops, where are we at here? Let me start with the older stuff that I've already said before, but I want to make it very clear. So the lab reports, obviously the due date depends on when you received your graded lab report back. However, I did recently post a due date, and off the top of my head, I don't remember what it was. So at the very latest, you guys will have that due date that I posted. So just check the announcements. Another thing, because I keep getting this question, and I just want to make it clear, just so you guys know, you didn't need to wait for the graded lab to get started on your lab report. As a matter of fact, you could have started your lab report before we even did the lab, right? You could have written a part of your abstract. You could have written the entire introduction. You could have written the entire, excuse me. Okay. You could have written the entire materials and methods. Granted, you may have had to gone back and edited it. You could have written portions of the discussion. So again, this is all before we even did the lab. Once the lab was done, at that point, you could have written the whole lab. And then the idea is, obviously, you wouldn't want to submit it in a perfect world until you got your graded lab back, just in case you needed to make some adjustments, right? So, for example, if you wrote your lab report before you got your graded lab back and you made some mistake, then you would know you need to make, if you made the mistake in the lab, you'd probably need to go back and fix that mistake in the lab report. So that's the only thing, right? It's not like you needed the lab. That was just my way of giving you guys a lot of time to do the lab report. So yes, please do the lab report. Let me know if you need help. Just like anything else, right? It's not like you have to sit behind the computer by yourself. Like, oh, where do I start? You can meet me online. We can talk it through it. Verbally discuss what you're going to write before you start writing it. But let me know. It's 8:00. Let's get started. The attendance is going to be, well, just like it usually would be for online. We're going to base it on attendance words. So the first official attendance word is exam. Let me say this very quickly, even though I'm going to put it in writing later. The exam 3 is now finally open. I've been working on it for a while. I don't want to bother you guys with the details, but it is open. It'll close next Friday at 11:59 p.m. It's just like it has been before. It's on Moodle. 50 questions, 50 minutes. If you need more time, let me know. We can meet online. If I can ensure that you're taking a closed book test, I don't care how long it takes you to take it. And of course, as usual, I always recommend keeping something ready to document any problems. Like keep a phone ready, charged. That way, if your Wi-Fi goes out, your computer starts smoking, your power goes out, whatever the case may be, you'll need to document that. But anyway, any questions about the exam? All right. This week's lab is technically due on Friday. It is probably, as far as the online virtual labs go, it is one of those that can be more complicated. It's not when you have practice, but the details are so intricate. I can see how it's confusing. So again, even though lab is technically Monday and Wednesday, I can still help you, right? If for some reason you waited until today to look at it, let me know if you need help. Meet me online and I can walk you through it. That's it. So let's jump into it. Does anybody have any questions about what's on the board? All right, let's jump into it. Just so you know, everybody, today we'll give a little bit of extra credit, for their attendance because you guys are dealing with so much. This has been such a crazy 2 weeks. Anyway, the last thing we talked about was Darwin's journey. We were talking about his observations, like what he witnessed, the kind of stuff he was doing when he was on his trip around the world. Specifically, we focused on what he did in South America. But also, and now let's talk about the new insights he gained. So while he was on his voyage, Darwin was also influenced by this guy named Charles Lyell in this book that he wrote called Principles of Geology. Excuse me. I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but this is important because this guy proposed some things. Somebody have a question?
I can't see the PowerPoint.
Thank you for letting me know. All right, let me go back and fix this. Come on. Anyway, while I'm fixing that, let's see here. Entire screen.
And I have one more question. Can we still retake exam 2, even though the other one is open now?
Yeah, as long as you do exam 2 before you do exam 3, then we're good. Good question. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So again, now we're back. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, good. So anyway, this guy wrote this book, and these ideas that he proposed are nothing new to us, but back in the day, they were literally and figuratively groundbreaking. Again, back then, they thought Earth was, 6,000 years old. But in this book, he presented the idea and some evidence that suggested, Earth is a lot older. Now we know it's billions of years, but back then, the idea, or in this book, he was thinking millions of years. But anyway, the book was proposing things that he had seen, that Charles Lyell had seen in geology, where things had changed over a long time. So again, I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, but the idea is try to get behind what Darwin was thinking. And again, he was seeing all these things when it comes to living organisms and fossils and all that. And then this other thing says, hey, life is very ancient, Earth is very ancient. Also, not only did he read that in this book, but he also witnessed the power of natural forces to change their surface when he experienced an earthquake, right? So he saw where he was in South Africa. So I keep wanting to say South Africa, but South America. There was an earthquake, and in that earthquake, he saw the coastline raised by 1 meter, which doesn't sound much, right? That's about 3 feet. But think about that. That's at once, right? So imagine how much things could change over millions of years, right? So because of all this, he began to doubt that Earth and its organisms had been created a few thousand years earlier. So any questions about this slide? And again, actually, I could have put a big old X through this whole slide. As far as the exam is concerned, it's an unimportant slide. It's just kind of giving you an insight to how he came up with the ideas he came up with. All right. Next word for attendance will be England. I was hoping somebody maybe can mute themselves. Not that I don't like music, but don't want to distract anybody. But anyway, when Charles Darwin got back to England, he started reflecting on his observations. He started analyzing his specimen collections. I'm sure he was a little bit already on his trip, but imagine you're on a ship and then finally you get back home. You can really spread things out and start analyzing what you have. And he also just started discussing his work with his colleagues. And after all that, and it wasn't right away. It's not like he just showed up to England and boom, here it was. But after a long time, he concluded that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways, right? So he finally came up with that idea, which was a kind of, again, a little bit in line with what Lamarck had said. But the new stuff was this. Over time, the differences between species and their ancestors and the descendants gradually accumulated by a process he called descent with modification. And descent with modification is now what we call natural selection. Oh, excuse me again. Somebody's doing something. Let me see what's going on. Sorry, guys. Goodness gracious. All right, well, I heard a noise. I don't know what it was for. Oh, okay. Anyway, let's move forward. So again, as far as the exam is concerned, this is all just leading up to the stuff you do need to know. There's not going to be questions about that, but you definitely need to know what natural selection is. Not necessarily that I'm going to ask you the definition of natural selection, but moving forward in this chapter, I'm going to teach you a lot about natural selection, and those are the things that you'll need to know. But to be clear, because this used to confuse me as a student because people didn't make this clear enough when I first learned about it. We have evolution, right? There's different types of evolution, right? Different types of evolution. And just one of them, the big one, is natural selection, right? So as we're talking about all of this whole chapter, keep in mind all these different things we're talking about, they all fall under evolution. But anyway, so natural selection, it states that individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals with other traits. And as you know from the past, from the previous lab, you could also expand on that because it's not just about surviving and reproducing. I mean, that's mostly it. But then obviously you would talk about what that results in, right? So the fact that they're able to survive and reproduce means they're passing down their genes. So whatever it is that helped them survive and reproduce is what's getting passed down to the next generation. Therefore, generation after generation, whatever it is that helps them be successful in that environment, the population is going to change to where more of them will have that trait. So again, we're talking about when he got back to England and what he came up with. He hypothesized that as descendants of remote ancestors spread into various habitats over millions and millions of years, that natural selection resulted in diverse modifications or evolutionary adaptations that fit them to specific ways of life for the environment. So this is going to be a really horrible drawing. But again, remember when we were talking about, of course, there's multiple islands, but remember we were talking about South America and the Galapagos Islands, right? So as you had an ancestor species that spread to the multiple Galapagos Islands, as time went on, the new species, the descendant species, will start looking different than the ancestor species. Yes, they came from the same species, but now they're in completely different environments. And after generations and generations, they're going to grow up in different ways and become different. So let's talk about Darwin's theory. Not that I'm going to ask you this, but it's not, again, he didn't just come up with this while he was on the boat. He didn't just come up with this right when he got back to England. He did all that research that we talked about earlier, that reflection. And then he spent 2 decades compiling and writing about it. But also, and I'm probably not going to ask you anything about this, but meanwhile, there's this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. You can click that link and watch a little video about him if you want. He was also a British naturalist. He was also doing field work, but he was doing his in Indonesia. I guess I shouldn't say he was also doing field work. Wallace was doing field work. Technically, remember, Darwin was just on a trip for charting. Not that any of that matters. I just wanted to correct myself. Anyway, Wallace conceived a hypothesis almost identical to Darwin's. So it's interesting that they weren't Facebooking each other. They weren't texting each other. They're in different parts of the world around the same time. So they didn't know much about each other. So it's interesting that they would both come up with these ideas at the same time. And then, anyway, I can't talk too much about it because we're a little bit behind, but you can see here's Indonesia. And based on the things I was saying about South America and the Galapagos Islands, we have similar situations here, right? We've got mainland Australia, we've got mainland Asia, then we have all these little islands. So again, imagine an ancestral species, leaving Southeast Asia and going to, one of them went to that island, one of them went to that island, one of them went to that island, and all those islands are different. So those species or those animals, or even plants, they all started the same as the same species, but then they were in different environments. Therefore, again, natural selection did its thing, and you would have different species. So in Darwin's book, he made 2 big proposals. The first one was that existing species descended from ancestral species, which we already said, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, which we already said. So this slide is basically a summarization of the previous slides we've talked about this morning. So any questions about that? All right. The next term for attendance will be Darwin Awards. That's the joke in this meme, because this guy's jumping in, to the very shallow part. But anyway, any questions about this slide before I move forward? All right, and to remind you, we're kind of going quick because we have a lot of catching up to do. And if you need a slower version, you can go back on the document of lecture videos and watch me do this slower. So the idea of evolution generated predictions that have been tested and verified by over 150 years of research, right? So it's still being put to the test. We still use those theories. As a matter of fact, the first time this semester, when we talked about the difference between theory and hypothesis and the relationship between the two, evolution was what we talked about, right? We talked about natural selection. But anyway, consequently, scientists regard evolution by means of natural selection as a theory, right? And we are, again, theory in science terms means something different than it does in regular terms. Like when you say, I have a theory in criminal justice, That means you have a hunch. A theory in science is something that's basically a widely accepted explanatory idea that, again, like you already know from the first chapter, is broader in scope than a hypothesis, generates new hypotheses, and supported by a large body of evidence. Now, this is important because we are now working on material. Chapter 11 on is material that's going to be on the final exam. And to remind you, the final exam is about 50 questions of this new stuff that we're covering right now, starting from chapter 11. And it's about 50 questions from the old exams, right? Old stuff and new stuff. So that being said, this information here I'm giving you was both given to you in the old stuff and the new stuff. So there's a higher probability that you're going to get this information on the final exam. All right, you need to know what a theory is, in other words. So are there any questions about this side? All right. Again, the theory of evolution states that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present day ones. And again, like I always like to point out, definitions are all written the same, different ways depending on what your source is. Even this book, depending on what chapter you're looking at, it might give you a different definition because it's defining the term in a different context. So just remember, I don't want you to memorize verbatim the definition, right? I just want you to understand what it means, right? So if someone could ask you, what is evolution? You could say it in your words, right? Not just spout out the words that you memorized. So now that we know how we got there, let's talk about some evidence of evolution. And this could be a whole exam if this was an evolution course, but this is not. We only have one chapter on evolution, and this is only one part of that chapter. So we're going to go through this quickly, but just keep in the back of your mind that we're really just scratching the surface here. But evidence of evolution. Evolution leaves observable signs. Speaking of signs, if I remember correctly, if you download this PowerPoint, you can click that sign. That's a link, and you can watch a little bit something about the evidence of evolution. Likewise here, you can click that link. It's a different video. You can watch videos about the evidence of evolution. Anyway, no need to write this down if you're a note taker, because we're going to talk about all three of these things separately. And I'm also not going to ask you, like, biological evolution has left evidence in what three things, right? So that won't be a test question. But if it was, the answers would be fossils, in today's organisms. Those two things. And then the today's organisms will also be subdivided into two things. But again, that won't be a question. So let's talk about evidence from fossils. What are fossils? Fossils document differences between past and present organisms, and they show that species have become extinct. So again, think about what we talked about the other day. That was a new idea, right? The species became extinct. People used to think, and some people still do, that everything that's living now has always lived and hasn't changed, and nothing has gone extinct. Anyway, speaking of fossils, your book does point out that the soft parts of organisms decay rapidly, while the hard parts that are rich in minerals are the things that may remain as fossils. So basically, that's where fossils come from, right? Fossils, well, some of the fossils, and we'll talk about this here in a few slides, but some of the fossils come from the actual remains of the organism, but it will have to be the remains that are rich in minerals, because what happens is those remains that are rich in minerals actually go through chemical changes, and they change into basically stone. Speaking of which, not all fossils are actual remnants, right? So the ones that we were just talking about in that previous slide are, because they were the remains that became fossilized. But there are some other examples. I'm probably not going to ask you about this, but if I do get it, if you do get any questions, it would be me asking you what a cast is, me asking you what an imprint is, or me asking you what a coprolite is. The question you will not get is, name the three types of fossils that are not actual remnants, right? I'm not going to do that. But really quickly, a cast is a buried organism that has decomposed and left an empty mold filled by minerals or dissolved in water. So, for example, I've seen fossils that show early dinosaurs that have feathers. It's not that the feathers were fossilized. It's just that they left that imprint in the, I shouldn't use the word imprint because that's the next one, but those feathers, you could see them because of the cast, right? But anyway, that brings us to an imprint. An imprint is something like a footprint or maybe a hole that they dug, right? So it just shows something that the animal did while they were alive, basically. So it's not the animal itself, or the plant for that matter. It's just the something that they did. And then the last one is coprolites, which I find interesting. It's fossilized poop, basically. And if you click this right here, this is a little short video. It's kind of funny, I think. It's a natural history museum. They're passing around fossils to all these people who are in the museum. They're like, oh, this is really neat. They've never touched a fossil, all kinds of different fossils, one of which was a coprolite. And then they told them what they were, and some people just got grossed out. Anyway, that brings us to a term that I might ask you about. I might not. Even if you forget this term, you'll be all right for the rest of the semester. But paleontologists are scientists who study fossils. Most people know that anyway, but there you go. Any questions about this slide? So it's actually quite rare for an entire organism, including the soft parts, to be preserved, basically. But it does happen. And some examples of that are insects that have been fossilized in tree resin, and that's something that we call amber. Not that I'm going to ask you what amber is. Well, I'll tell you what amber is. Amber is the next word for attendance. But anyway, yeah, and I'm sure you guys have all seen Jurassic Park, where they show at the very beginning, they're showing how it worked. The mosquito lands on the tree, gets covered in sap, that becomes hard. You have amber. Then they extracted the dino DNA out of the back of the mosquito. But anyway, that's what amber is. There's also some examples of larger animals like mammoths, bison, even some prehistoric humans that have been frozen in ice or preserved in bogs, right? So these aren't fossils, right, necessarily, but they are preserved ancient organisms. And again, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click this. There's a lot of embedded videos that you can watch in here. So are there any questions about this slide? Okay, I'm not going to ask you what amber is. I'm not going to ask you what are some things that have been preserved in frozen ice or preserved bogs. Again, the idea that I'm trying to impart here is that it's not just fossils, even though this is the category that we're talking about. But there's also completely preserved ancient organisms. Here's some pictures of what I'm talking about, right? Here's actual remnants, right? That's a bone of a dinosaur that's been fossilized, right? The minerals turned it into stone. Same here, right? The minerals in this tree made that turn into petrified wood, right? It's stone now, but it used to be a tree. Here's imprints, right? So we don't actually see the animal. We don't see the dinosaur, but we see the footprint it left. There's the amber I was talking about. And of course, here's a frozen mammoth, or at least its tusks. So let's talk about the fossil record. The fossil record, not that I'm going to ask you the definition of it, but it is the sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers, marking the passage of geological time. So really quickly, this picture should look familiar to you, even if you haven't seen this exact spot, because I don't remember where I took this picture. But this is something that we would see all the time on, I don't know, 119 or I-64, right? We see this all the time. And basically what this is the Earth kind of turned sideways. This would be the top. This would be the bottom. And what we know from geological records, even if you're not a geologist, right? A geologist could look at this and tell you how long ago it was. And they could look at this and tell you how long ago it was. Even if you can't do that, like they probably couldn't back in the day, what you do know is that anything you found, I don't know, right here. Actually, let me ask you this to see if anyone gets it. Let's say you find an organism right there, and you also find an organism right here, organism B. I should have put a B right there. Whoops. And then you find an organism right there, organism C. Which organism do you think is the oldest? Does anybody want to venture to guess? Hopefully you're just too shy to say it, because it should be pretty obvious. Like I said, this is the top, this is the bottom, right? So these are the older organisms, right? There was something living here that was buried here that got fossilized here. And then as time went on, more stuff got buried, more stuff got buried, more stuff got buried, more stuff got buried. So even if you can't tell exactly, like, oh, this was 1 billion years ago, this was 0.5 billion years ago, right? Even if you can't tell that, you can say, if I find a bunch of fossils here, I can tell you that anything found, on this side is going to be younger than anything found on this side. So again, when we're talking about evolution and this thing descended from that thing, that's important information, right? So again, without even knowing exactly the date, we do know this thing came before that thing, and that thing came before this thing, so on and so forth. So any questions about this slide? All right. As Darwin acknowledged, the fossil record is incomplete. I hear this all the time about people who deny evolution. Of course, the fossil record is incomplete. You know, well, speaking of which, before I even get into this really quickly, people will say, you know, where's the missing link? If humans came from blah blah blah, then where's the fossils for in between, right? Or organism organism Z was descended from organism A, then where's that organism in between, right? That's what we're talking about, right? Where are the fossils that link this thing to this thing? But the fossil record is incomplete. For one thing, many organisms didn't live in areas that favor fossilization. So there's some places where they just died and that was it. They just disintegrate, you know, they decomposed, nothing was left. There was no fossils. Also, many fossils were in rocks that were later distorted or destroyed by geological processes. So really quickly think about the stuff I was saying on Wednesday about, for example, how the Himalayas were formed, right? When the subcontinent of India crashed into Asia, if there was any rocks at that border, you know, obviously they're getting crushed. And then likewise, not all fossils are accessible to paleontologists, right? So there are fossils at the bottom of the ocean that we just can't get to, for example. That's just one example. So again, the reason why we are missing links from, you know, ancestor A to descendant Z is because the fossil record is incomplete. Likewise, I want to point this out because your book didn't. Let's say we're looking for some kind of fossil record that linked this organism to this organism. Well, let's say we find it, right? And let's call it, I don't know, organism S, right? Now, the deniers will then forget about Z and they'll be like, okay, well, then what links A to S, right? And then we find an organism that comes between them. I don't know, organism K. So then the deniers will forget about that one and say, okay, well, then what links A to K, right? So for the people who are denying, there's almost nothing you can do, right? Every time you find a link, then there's going to be yet another link that could be found. But anyway, any questions about this slide? There's not going to be questions about this. The idea here is the fossil record provides evidence that evolution occurred, and these are the flaws in the fossil record. All right. Darwin predicted the existence of fossils of transitional forms linking very different groups of organisms. That's what I was just talking about, like organism A to organism Z and looking for the missing links. And those missing links in biology are actually called transitional fossils. Not that I'm going to ask you that, but that's what they are, right? Transitional fossils show the combinations of traits. And some examples include, but are definitely not limited to, the Archaeopteryx, which displayed combinations of reptilian and bird-like features. So again, doing what I was doing earlier, you know, the link from dinosaur to birds, right? People said, hey, dinosaurs are descendants from birds. And then other people said, well, where's the link to that? Well, this was the link. So that was the missing link between dinosaurs and birds. But of course, now, like I said earlier, now people are like, okay, well, what's the link between dinosaurs and that dinosaur? But anyway, any questions about this slide? All right. Well, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you anything about any examples. I probably won't even ask you what a transitional fossil is, but if I do, I'm certainly not going to ask you any examples that I've given you. Here's another example. This is from the old textbook. Your new textbook doesn't have this, the process of science. I'm skipping it as I always do, but I did leave it on the PowerPoint for those of you who like to read PowerPoints and study, because this is good additional information. But I am going to skip it again because I'm not going to test it on you, or test you on it, excuse me. All right. So again, we're still talking about evidence. We're done talking about evidence from evolution. Let's talk about evidence from homologies. First of all, if we're going to do that, you need to know what a homology is. So similarities resulting from a common ancestor is known as homology, right? So the fact that all I'll probably get there soon, but you know, a lot of vertebrates have 4 limbs. You know, they might look different, very different, but the fact that we all, you know, those of us that all have 4 limbs, that means we have a common ancestor. I mean, that's not the proof, but that is big proof, right? But anyway, those 4 limbs, that's homology, right? Even the fact that we're bilateral symmetry, meaning, I don't have time to get into it. Let's just stick to what the book says. Anyway, characteristics in ancestral organisms that have altered over time as descendants face different environmental conditions, right? So the same concepts of stuff that we were talking about earlier, right? You have the ancestor. As time goes on, the ancestor, things change in the environment. Therefore, there's different advantages and disadvantages to different traits they have. So the descendants will look different after a while because they're facing different environmental conditions. Therefore, related species can have characteristics that have underlying similarities, yet very different functions, right? And this is what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. But this is all talking about homology, right? We're talking about things that are different from our ancestors or amongst each other, but still have something that's kind of the same. And to help you remember that, I should have mentioned this earlier or reminded you earlier. Remember, that's what this prefix homo means, right? Homo means same, right? So here we're talking about same features. Darwin cited similarities amongst vertebrate forelimbs as evidence of common ancestors. So I just previously in the last slide was talking about all the limbs, like, hey, we all have those organisms that have 4 limbs. That's evidence of common ancestry. Darwin gets a little bit more specific and talks about forelimbs themselves. And for arms, or for humans, we call a forelimb an arm, right? But there's also 4 legs, flippers, wings, depends on the animal, right? These are all variations on anatomical structures of ancestral organisms that over millions of years became adapted to different functions. Really quick, not that you need to know this, but an example of that is before life, life started in the oceans, it started in water. And the leading theory right now, this is going to be horrible, I'll try to draw it, is that, our common ancestor was some type of fish, right? That's horrible. Anyway, that fish, believe it or not, is a little bit like us in that it has limbs. It has those 4 limbs. It has, 2 flippers in the front, 2 flippers in the back. Anyway, it makes its way on the land, and it becomes, eventually we start having amphibians. Again, they're 4-limbed, but they're basically a modified version of a fish. And then those amphibians led way to reptiles, so on and so forth. But again, these are homologies, right? The idea that we have all these things that are different, yet have some similarities because we come from a common ancestor. And you can see the similarities here, right? That even though you're looking at a human, a lizard, a cat, a whale, bat, frog, we all have a forearm with 5 phalanges, forearm with 5 phalanges, forearm, 5 phalanges, forearm, 5, even a whale, right? That whale flipper looks like a flipper, but if you were to look at the bones, it's sort of like there's the wrist. Well, no, that's the forearm technically. And then what you would call 5 fingers. Of course, these are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about those examples. Any questions about this slide? All right. This is a picture from the old textbook. Again, we're looking at homologies. And again, in this case, we're looking at forearms. And in this case, I guess they're focusing on just one particular bone in the forearm and then the wrist bones, the carpals. But you can see there are similarities. But you can also see that they're very different, right? Because even though we have a common ancestor, we went through different environmental conditions. So we needed different things from our forelimbs. So humans, we can manipulate a lot of things with our hands. Cats use mostly just theirs to walk around and knock stuff off of your counters. Whales, they need it to swim. Bats, they need it to fly, right? All these similarities. And these are all mammals, right? That last slide I showed you was also included reptiles, right? And this is just mammals. But even amongst just the animals, you can see all these different functions: flying, swimming, holding things, knocking things off counters, right? It's all there. And of course, by the way, just to remind you that, again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about humans, cats, or whales, or bats. Anatomical similarities in different organisms, which is what we have been talking about, are called homologous structures. So to be clear, let me take a step back because that could be confusing. We're still talking about homologies, but now I'm telling you homologies are broken down into different subcategories. So one of them is homologous structures, which is what we've actually been talking about. I just didn't give it a name. And then there's another one that we're going to talk about when we move forward. But yes, these are still talking about homologies. You're not going to need to know how these all fit in together. Like, I'm not going to say, is a homologous structure a subcategory of homologies, or is homologies a subcategory of homologous structures? Don't worry about that. Just understand what homologies are. Anyway, so yes, everything we've been talking about so far are homologous structures. And the definition of it, not that I'm going to ask you, I'm almost definitely not, I shouldn't say almost definitely. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to ask you But the definition of it is features that have different functions, but are structurally similar because of common ancestry, right? So everything we just have been talking about the past couple slides, there it is, put into one nice, neat little sentence. And again, here's some more pictures I found from some other places that show these homologous structures, right? Different functions, but they're still similar. So any questions about this? Excuse me. So there have been advances in molecular biology that have provided much deeper understanding of homologies. So speaking of which, again, broad category here is homologies. The one we just got finished talking about was structural homologies. Now we're talking about this one. This is another subcategory. And basically, we're talking about molecular homologies. So the evolutionary history of each species is documented in their DNA that is inherited from its ancestral species. You could go on and on about this, but we don't have time. But one great example of that is, if you look at all the DNA of humans, you would find out that we have very, very few differences in our entire genome, right? So if you were to sequence my genome and sequence your genome and sequence somebody's genome in Bulgaria, wherever, you would find that all in all, like, we're actually very, very similar. If you were to compare humans and chimpanzees, you would also find very similar. Not as similar as you and I, but also very similar. If you were to compare the sequence of humans and orangutans, you would find they're very similar. Not as similar as us and orangutans, but very similar. If you were to compare the genome of humans and bananas, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure about this number, but you would find that our DNA is about 50% similar. The point being, and there's a more elegant way to talk about this if we had time and if this wasn't a 100 level class, but generally speaking, you could say, generally, not always, when you compare the DNA, the more similarities they are, the closer related you are, right? That makes sense. Same thing for humans. If you just look at a family tree, right, the more similarities you have in your genome, the more closely related you are to that other human. So this is actually probably all common sense. You just have to kind of wrap your head around it and put it into this concept of biology. Anyway, you can read this. Your book basically says the same thing, but they talk specifically about homologous genes and sequences and all that. But what I'm saying, I think, is a more simpler and way to think about it, and as far as we're concerned, just as accurate. So if their genomes are more similar, then they're more closely related, and have a more recent common ancestor. And if their genomes are more different, then you're less related. Anyway, any questions about that? The next word for attendance will be common. Molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are related, right? That's what we were saying in the last slide, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more. These are just some examples of this. Not sure if I'm going to ask you this, but we'll see. So all living things that we know of on Earth use the same genetic language, right? So this DNA, RNA stuff that we've been talking about previously, that's all the same. And actually, that's one of the things I even told you, right? The code is universal, right? We talked about that when we talked about how transcription and translation and all that stuff, right? So that itself is a molecular homology, right? That itself is evidence of evolution. Yep. So any questions about that? So these two bullet points are definitely just examples of these two bullet points. So again, I'm definitely not going to ask you about bacteria engineered with human genes or stuff like that, but definitely know those, or I might ask you about those two upper bullet points. Geneticists have also uncovered hidden molecular homologies. Organisms may retain genes that have lost function through mutations, even though the homologous genes of related species are fully functional. I've already given you an example of this earlier in the semester. Humans cannot produce our own vitamin C. We're one of the few mammals who can't, but also other primates cannot make their own vitamin C, which is evidence that all the primates have a common ancestor. Now, let me make it even more complicated, even though I've said this before. So even though we can't make our own vitamin C, we have the gene to do it. The problem is our gene has mutated, so it no longer works, right? But if we were created, in my opinion, it would have to have been through natural selection. Therefore, the gene is still there. But if we were just created from scratch, why put in the broken gene, right? But anyway, my point being, we had one common ancestor who was doing just fine, making its own vitamin C, but somehow that ancestral species had a mutation and they could no longer make their vitamin C. Then after evolution, that ancestral species gave rise to other descendant species, right? These primates. And again, that one ancestral species has the broken gene. So now all the primates have that broken gene, unlike almost any other mammal on Earth, right? Any other species of mammal. Anyway, many of these inactive genes are identified in humans. Oh, yeah, including the thing I just talked about, all this stuff that I just talked about. So, any questions about this slide? The whole vitamin C thing is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. There's a really good book on this. Humans, our bodies, and our genomes have a lot of this stuff. We have a lot of useless parts and useless genes that used to serve a purpose, but over billions of years, they stopped serving a purpose, but they're still there because there's no way to just delete it from your genome, right? Which brings us up to something called vestigial structures. So when I was just talking about how we have useless things, not just in our genomes, but in our body that don't work anymore, there's a name for that, and it's called vestigial structures. The technical definition is the remnants of features that served important functions in organisms' ancestors, right? So again, the way I think of it is, my definition is vestigial structures are useless structures that we have that used to serve a purpose in our ancestors. These are just examples, but we'll talk about it very quickly. Your book talks about how whales or ancient whales still had little tiny leg bones, right? They don't need leg bones. They swim. They've got fins. But I guess I should have mentioned this earlier. Not that it's that important. It's definitely not important as far as the exam is concerned. The whales used to be land-dwelling animals, and they kind of evolved and went back into the ocean, right? So once that happened, there was no more need for legs, but it took a long time for those legs to completely disappear. But yes, they were still there in ancient whales. Also, if you look at cavefish, right, they still have eye spots, right? The eyes aren't working, but you can tell there used to be eyes, right? And they don't eat them. It's completely dark where they live. Goosebumps on humans. If we had time, I would ask you to see if anybody can guess why we get them. And what purpose they may have served for our ancestors. But long story short, one of the reasons we get goosebumps, aka chill bumps, is because when you can get cold and you get the chill bumps, right? And that used to serve a purpose. When we were hairier than we are, of course, I'm still pretty hairy, but for those of you who are normal, when we were hairier and your hair did this, what would happen is it would form this little insulative blanket of air in between your skin and the surface of your hair, right? So it actually served a purpose to keep us warm. Now it does nothing. Any questions about this, about vestigial structures? I know independent work is past due, but if I've already told you what I'm going to do about that, and you can still turn them in. I might grade it, I might not. But anyway, this is interesting stuff to look into, in my opinion. Look at some other vestigial structures for humans or any other organism that you might find interesting. So again, we're still talking about homologies, right? Homology can explain observations about embryonic development as well, right? So again, this is a different type of homology. Now we're talking about looking at embryos. And I'm not going to ask you any questions about this, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide and show you a picture of what I'm talking about. But, here's a human embryo, here's a chicken embryo. It's very interesting that a lot of tetrapods, which are reptiles, fish, fish a little bit different, but reptiles, some amphibians, mammals, right? We are tetrapods, meaning we have 4 limbs. Anyway, when you look at our embryos, they look very similar, right? We start off very similarly. We have these things called pharyngeal pouches, which for us turn into ears. For fish, they turn into gills. We have this post-anal tail. Obviously, chicken keeps its tail. Humans, we don't. But anyway, there's a lot of different other things that are similar between our embryos. And again, this is evidence of a common ancestry. So any question about that? All right, let's jump into biogeography. We've only got less than 8 minutes, so I need to move quickly here. The geographic distribution of organisms follows patterns that are best explained by the evolution in conjunction with the movement of tectonic plates. That word went away. Basically, what we're saying is, all right, so this is what the world used to look like at one point, and you can see South America, Africa, Australia, the subcontinent of Africa, or excuse me, of Asia. Good grief, the subcontinent of India had not yet moved and crashed into the rest of Asia yet, right? But anyway, all these things used to be together. So imagine organisms that lived here must have been, well, could have been possibly the same species. They could have started off as the same species. But then here we go, in a sense, what we're talking about here is another form of, good grief, I can't think this morning. The idea that, again, it's geography that's causing the speciation, right? So they used to all be together here on the left, and then the world changed and things moved. But still, we have organisms in this red area who are similar to each other today. They have these similarities. And it's not because, some organism, some species started here and then jumped its way over the Atlantic to Africa and then jumped its way over to the Indian Ocean, to Southeast Asia, right? No, it didn't happen like that. They were all living together until things separated. And I'm sorry, the word I was thinking of earlier was allopatric speciation that we talked about earlier, right? Anyway, any questions about that? Probably no questions about it on the exam, but the idea here is, what I'm trying to say is, again, another example of allopatric speciation. They were together, so they were, similar, but then once they separated, they started evolving in different ways. So yeah, they're similar still because they have a common ancestor that lived here on the left, but they became different over time. So any questions about this slide? All right, let's talk about evolutionary trees. Darwin was the first person to visualize the history of life as a tree with patterns of descent branching from a common trunk, with the first organism to the tips of millions of twigs representing the species living today. That's what your book says. I would just say Darwin was the first to visualize history of life as a family tree. You're all familiar with a family tree. This is basically what we're talking about. Obviously, it's a lot different because with the family tree, you're talking about just the descendants of one particular family of humans. And what we're talking about with Darwin is the family tree of all living things, but it's still similar. Biologists illustrate patterns of descent with evolutionary trees, although the trees turn sideways so they can be read from left to right. I'm obviously not going to ask you anything about that. That's just so you know, when you see a tree that looks like this, that's why it's left from right. Because, again, when you think of a family tree, you might think of up and down, but because of the nature of what we're talking about here, it's usually left to right. But I'm probably not going to ask you any questions about evolutionary trees, but it does show, right? So you can look at the common ancestors, and that shows that things are more closely related, right? So one thing you might get on the exam, but probably not, I might give you this picture on the exam and say something like, what's more closely related, hawks and ostriches or hawks and crocodiles? Of course, that would be very, very easy without even looking at this. I'll probably give you something a little bit harder, but the idea, if you were to look at that, like, well, hawks and ostriches have a common ancestor here. Hawks and crocodiles don't have a common ancestor in here. So I'm going to say hawks and ostriches are more closely related. But that's how it works, right? The farther you go back, right? If this was a graph, then the x-axis is time, right? This is now, this was the past, right? And way back when, we don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly what organism, but we had one common ancestor. Well, this is, okay, I'm sorry. Let me kind of repeat that, not that it matters for the exam, but just so you know, this is obviously on the animals, right? This isn't even fungi or bacteria or plants, but just looking at the family tree, if you will, of animals. Anyway, there was one common ancestor, and it was most likely a sponge, believe it or not, or some sponge-like creature. And then from that, we went all these other directions, but we don't have time to get into all that. Anyway, I'm sorry. Good grief. Not that this matters for the exam, but I'm in a rush and I'm making mistakes. I don't want to leave you with wrong information, but we aren't just looking at animals. We are looking at vertebrates. So very, very stupid of me to say that. So sorry, because this also doesn't include worms and sponges, like I said earlier, or insects. Those are all animals, right? These are only vertebrates. But yes, we had this one common ancestor that was most likely some sort of pre-amphibian thing. But anyway, we'll move forward. Any questions about this? Okay, so again, when you're studying, don't memorize this. Don't study this picture and say, I need to memorize, you know, how closely mammals are related to lizards versus amphibians. Like, there's nothing to memorize here. But if I were to give you this picture, be able to decipher a question about it. Sorry about the noises in the background. I'm teaching from home, and my youngest daughter is hell on wheels. Anyway, evolutionary trees are hypotheses that reflect current understanding of patterns of evolutionary descent, right? They're hypotheses. I mean, some of them, depending on the one we looked at back there, was probably more like a theory than a hypothesis because it wasn't very specific, right? I mean, this one just says other birds. So, right. So imagine all the thousands of species of birds. That in itself would be its own family tree, right? But anyway, these are hypotheses. Some of them are based on convincing combination of the evidence that we talked about, right? Fossil records, looking at homologies, right? And the anatomical homologies, looking at molecular homologies, looking at embryonic homologies, right? All those things that we talked about, homologies, all those things we talked about earlier. That's part of the evidence that they compile to make these evolutionary trees. But others admittedly are more speculative because sufficient data is not yet available. Think about, for example, when a new species is found, right? Then that's this one right here. If you find a new species, it's going to take a while to figure out where it belongs. I will say this though, again going back to the bird example, if you find some new species of bird, obviously it's going to belong in here in this evolutionary tree. But again, if you just had one evolutionary tree for birds, right? You know, um, whatever it may look like, you would have to figure out exactly where it belongs in that evolutionary tree, right? What genus should it be in? What family should it be in? All those things. Any questions about this side? I'm also going to go through this really quickly because this is kind of a part two of the whale thing that we skipped earlier that I'm not going to ask you any questions on. But again, I highly recommend reading it. Those things are good reads. They really get your brain thinking the way they should. We're running out of time. Let's get through this very quickly. Natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. Okay, so when we get back on Monday, this is where we'll pick up is talking about, again, we're going back to natural selection. We're going to learn a little bit more about it. We've scratched the surface. We'll go learn more about it. So the next word for attendance is action, or the last word for attendance is action. I'm going to get up. Well, I'm not going to get off. I'm going to step away from my computer for about 10 minutes. I'll be back at 9 for office hours. If you have any questions or need any help, I'll be there to help you, especially for that lab. Like I said, that lab can be difficult only because there's so many instructions. But that's it for today. I hope you guys have a good weekend. You'll all get a little bit of extra credit for attending as my way of making up for all this garbage that we've had to go through. So, any questions about anything? All right. Well, then that's it. You guys have a good day, a good weekend, and I'll either see you on Monday or see you in office hours sometime after 9 a.m. Did you have any questions?
Yeah, hello?
Yeah, what's up?
So is the lab 9 and 10 due today, or just one lab is due?
Every week, every week the different lab is due. So this week it is the Hardy Weinberg lab. Yes.
Okay. Because last week it was the power out. I didn't know what
Oh
lab.
yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Good grief. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, technically then, and I should have reminded everybody else, but I'm being pretty loose on the due dates with labs. But yes, technically this week you have last week's lab that was due and this week's lab.
All right, just making sure. Thank you.
Great question. No, you're welcome. Let me know if you need help.
All right.